introduction. I was a fellow here at the Institute of Politics in the spring semester, and I see a few of you who were attended my study group. I talked about the media and the primary process. Since then, I've returned to what is known as the real world, and frankly, after having been out there, I'm happy to be back at Harvard. But this summer and fall, I was the executive producer of the presidential debates, and prior to that time, prior to coming here, I was a network news executive and producer for 23 years. And so it's over. After 600 days and about 1,000,000 miles of travel by the two candidates, it's finally just about over. After the expenditure of $92 million of public money and at least that much more of private money, soft money, independent expenditures, the final appeal is being made on the networks right now by Governor Dukakis, and Vice President Bush's program will follow at 8:30 tonight. Price tag for the two cool $1 million. Then it's time for us to have our say. About 95 million of us will vote tomorrow, fewer if you listen to the gloom and doom of people like Nancy Newman of the League of Women Voters, more than 95 million if you listen to the political experts in the big states. My own guess is that it will be more rather than fewer. It has been a negative campaign fought out on the nation's airwaves, on cable channels, in the direct mail that's been flooding into our mailboxes, 46 million pieces from the Republicans alone. The radio commercials, the call-in shows, and also the water fountain gossip where we argue with our colleagues. Some of the best talk of Campaign 88 was heard right here in this forum, notably in the conversations the candidates had with Marvin Kalb on public television, but also in countless forums and discussions with faculty, students, fellows, and visitors to the Kennedy School. Tonight we're going to have the opportunity to consider some of the ways in which the candidates got their messages out to the public through the news media and in other ways, if you buy the view that they indeed had a message. Our panelists are the authors of the important new book, The Electronic Commonwealth, The Impact of New Media Technologies on Democratic Politics. You will meet them in a moment. The thrust of their book, if I may be so bold as to reduce it to a soundbite, is that they say, as they say in Chapter 3, quote, communications technologies have always shaped our politics. These technologies have profound impact on how we conduct ourselves as a democratic society. They can be both threatening and beneficial. But thanks to the First Amendment, they must be coped with, thought about, accommodated to. They can't simply be banned, as new ways to distribute information has so often been banned in many countries around the world. The campaign of '88 has seen the extensive use of all of the technologies that our panelists have written about: computers, direct mail, cable television, satellites, and broadcast television, of course. The other day we read about an Associated Press reporter who was juggling a tape recorder, a laptop computer, and a cellular telephone all at the same time, and he said plaintively, quote, I spend 90% of my time worrying about logistics and 10% of my time worrying about the news. As a former network television producer with a lot of time on the road covering presidential campaigns, I have to admit that I don't have too much sympathy with him. For 99% of us, the campaign is what we see on television, of course. And as the producer of this year's debates, I had a view, although I can't say it was a bird's eye view, because it was through that slot in the backdrop that you probably saw where the cameras were protruding. But I had a view of the candidates that as they prepared for the debates. I observed during one of the run-up periods to the first debate, when Governor Dukakis had appeared for his sound and light check at Wake Forest a couple of hours before the debate, that he appeared very tense. His man replied, so would you be too if your entire 30-year career was on the line when you stood out there at that podium tonight in front of about 70 million Americans and God only knows how many millions of others around the globe, and you made just one mistake. This is as tense as it gets. Jim Lehrer, who moderated that debate, said later that he had never before in his life actually smelled fear, but he smelled fear that night at Waite Chapel. So the televised debates were watershed events in this campaign, as they have been in every campaign since '76. Did television dominate the campaign, and if so, is that all bad? We'll talk about that and the impact of the other technologies with our experts tonight. First, we're going to hear from Gary Orrin. Gary is a faculty member here and the associate director of the Joan Shorenstein Barone Center on the Press, Politics, and Public Policy. He's also a public opinion analyst. He's been a consultant in public opinion polling to the New York Times, where he and others began the CBS News New York Times poll. He served as a political advisor in a number of election campaigns. He teaches on public opinion, politics, and the press, and he is, as I said earlier, a co-author of the book The Electronic Commonwealth, The Impact of New Media. He graduated summa cum laude from my daughter's alma mater, Oberlin College, which is a very expensive college, I can tell you all. And he received his Ph.D. in political science here at Harvard. Gary?
Thank you. You always learn something at forum events, and I learned about your daughter tonight. I think that my favorite one-liner on television appeared in a Saturday Review cartoon. It was the caption of a cartoon there a few years ago. It asked the following question. It said, if a tree falls in the forest and television is not there to cover it, has the tree really fallen? I think that this captures the profound change in the political landscape that television has wrought. On average, an American television set now in this country is on 7 hours a day. And that is a very important change over the last 35 years. My view, however, on the 1988 election, I'm going to talk about television, both the old television, broadcast television, and a little bit about new technologies. My view is that not all that much is totally new that we saw in this 88 election. Not that many new departures, really. Not that there weren't some very important things that happened. I think there's a tendency for people who aren't watching these, aren't obliged, really, professionally, to watch these elections year in and year out, to see something new under the sun all the time. I think, in fact, what we saw this time was really a lot of continuation of trends, accentuation of trends, if you will, an aggravation of trends that my colleagues and I lament in the electronic commonwealth, but not that much that was brand new. But there's some very important continuation of some alarming trends in our political system. I would call your attention to two of these trends in particular, though there are quite a number that we can talk about, we probably will talk about. Two strike me as very important. One is the growing dominance of candidate-centered campaigns. It's the candidates and their campaigns, and not political parties, not interest groups, not even the news media, that's really dominating and controlling what happens, what it is that the viewers experience, the viewers, I should say the voters, but it is indeed the viewers, experience during these election contests. So candidate-centered campaigns are really, that trend was very much accentuated. And secondly, the growing dominance of television. These two things are very closely interrelated. This point about the growing dominance of television is itself a sub-theme of a larger, and I find even more alarming theme, and that is the tightening grip of technology on our political life. If you will, what is sometimes called the technologization of politics. Excuse the phrase. What we've witnessed in 1988 is ever more so the hegemony of polls and pollsters, of direct mail and direct mailers, of paid political advertising and political admin. But these are, of course, things that we have seen before. It's just, again, an accentuation, a continuation, an aggravating of the previous pattern. Now, for me, there were really two signal events over the course of the '88 campaign that captured both of these trends and the interrelationship among them, candidate-centered campaigns and the dominance of television. One had to do with what's called free media, news coverage, or what earlier in the campaign I think one of the campaigners said was shouldn't be called free media but should be called earned media. News coverage on the one hand and paid political media, political spots, political advertising on the other. On the free media, I was struck by the night of the first televised debate. Peter Jennings sat on the panel of questioners. It was the first debate, right? The questioners, and then after the debate, he scurried quickly up to the broadcasting booth to join his colleagues, where David Brinkley and a few others were chatting about the campaign, about the debate, which everyone had just seen. And they asked Peter Jennings. He said, Brinkley asked Jennings, "Now you were up on the stage. You were right there, close at hand, up close and personal, as I think they say. What do you think happened, or who do you think won?" Jennings, without losing a beat, said, "I don't know. I didn't see it on television." He was dead serious, and it seemed to me he really captured an important feature of this presidential election. The second signal event concerns the paid political advertising, the unfree media, and this was an event that happened early on in the general election campaign. I think if we were to sort out a series of issues, defense issues, the economy, abortion, this one, that one, and say which ones we thought before the campaign started were going to be Dukakis's issues, which ones seemed to be his advantage, which ones were to Bush's advantage, that 9 out of 10 judges would say that the environment was going to be a Dukakis issue in the 1988 campaign. I think that it's safe to say, without too much editorializing, that the Reagan administration has a rather shabby record on this over the last 8 years, a record which John Oakes, in a very poignant op-ed piece in the New York Times, called a despicable record. But in any case, not one to be extremely proud of, and it looked like it was going to be a Dukakis issue for sure. What struck me was that in one paid political advertisement, the Boston Harbor ad, the Bush campaign was able to obliterate an 8-year record. We've been told before that visuals, the picture, outweighs the words. There's been much talk about that over the last several years, and we think here we have an example, I think, of a very striking one of how a picture obliterates not just words but action, a record. It got to the point where the Dukakis campaign was reluctant to bring up the environment, which presumably was going to be their record, for fear of the Boston Harbor would be mentioned again and again, and this was going to grab people because they had seen that visual, that political advertisement. So we have free media and paid media in the 1988 campaign. Now, there's an important question before us, I think, that we shouldn't dodge so easily, and that is the question of whether TV, be it paid or free television, and campaigning in general, for that matter, really mattered in 1988. This is something we just can't assume. And in fact, I think it will be the subject of some debate in the postmortems that will follow tomorrow's balloting. It will be put in the following form. Could anybody have beaten Bush given peace and prosperity? Was everything that happened over the course of the campaign that we witnessed just a lot of flotsam and jetsam, sound and fury, signifying very little, because basically the underlying peace and prosperity of the country was really what was the engine, the fuel behind what happened? I think there will be some debate about that issue. That was brought home to me a few days ago when I sat on a panel before a group of political scientists who were eager to talk about and take the stand that really television and campaigning in general had really no effect, no real importance in this campaign, so that what we're sort of talking about this evening really is by the by. That it was long-term political forces, as they call them, things that really are beyond the candidate's control. They're sort of out there before they were nominated, that really were moving things here. And they were eager, enthusiastic to tell the audience about their models, which predicted back when, so as they plugged in the relevant aggregate data of the percentage of Democrats, Republicans, and independents in the country, lots of information about the state of the economy, the state of international affairs. They plugged these things into their models and could predict reasonably closely the popular vote or the electoral college vote that we're going to see tomorrow. So why are we wasting our time talking about campaigns and television? I happen to, although I am a card-carrying political scientist, I happen to disagree with that position. While I do recognize and appreciate the importance of long-term forces, peace and prosperity was an important factor in this election. The distribution of partisan loyalties in the electorate was important. Other long-term forces were important. But I don't buy the basic conclusion that TV and campaigning, stuff like that, wasn't important. The argument of the critical role of television and campaigning, polls, things like that, short-term forces as they call them, the argument that those things were important in the primaries is a pretty easy argument. Political scientists, in fact, concede that point. They acknowledge that short-term forces, polls, television, all the rest, dominate the nomination process. The question comes in the general election. I would submit that we need to recall that the same peace and prosperity that people are talking about now, which maybe made all the campaigning moot, that same peace and prosperity in July was around when people were asking whether this race was winnable by George Bush. And in fact, more importantly, peace and prosperity at that time was a problem. Not an opportunity, was a problem for George Bush. Whenever George Bush was put up in comparison in any way, shape, or form with Ronald Reagan at that stage in the campaign, it seemed to be a liability, not an asset for him, that Reagan cast a large shadow on him. And in fact, one of the most interesting things that we saw in our polls over the course of the spring and into the summer was that the American public was unwilling, at best grudgingly, but basically unwilling, to give much credit to George Bush for the state of the economy and for our situation in the international community. It was not an asset for him. It was, in fact, not until about midway in the fall campaign, after Bush had beat up Dukakis so well, painted a picture of him through television, a picture of him as a coddler of criminals and rapists and an all-around risky fellow, a risky liberal fellow, that the electorate was willing to start giving credit to Bush for peace and prosperity. Secondly, I suggest that Dukakis had a chance, I think, in fact, a good chance, early in the campaign to help shape his own image. I mean, he was a brand new face. People didn't know who he was. He wasn't bringing much baggage to the national arena. To shape his own image and that of his opponent to some extent, because people really didn't have a crystallized view of Bush at that point, and thereby escape the historical patterns that were embodied in these political science models that tell us it's all just the state of the economy. It's not television or anything like that. The point is that Dukakis muffed it. To me, that is the most puzzling thing about this campaign, that we can talk about it. I don't think I have a very good fix on exactly strategically what the Dukakis campaign was doing in those first crucial 10 or 12 weeks. I think Dukakis had a chance to shape what is called here in the Kennedy School, those of you who are students here familiar with this phrase, the face of the issue. The way, in this case, the face of the liberal issue. how will liberalism be thought of in this campaign. He had a chance to do some shaping. He muffed that. Instead, what happened over this critical period was that the percentage of Americans who thought that Dukakis was a liberal and he had escaped during the primaries, having been portrayed overwhelmingly as a liberal, and that was indeed an important part of his strategy in the primaries, that percent who saw him as a liberal went from 27% in May up to, well, today it's at about 53%, 52, 53, essentially a doubling over that period of time, and it went up with Bush's kind of Chinese water drop torture hammering away on that business against him. At the same time that liberalism index went up, his negatives, he went from a net favorability kind of impression on the public to a strong unfavorability. His negatives soared, as they say, during that period. And this wasn't just due to the political ads. The political ads contributed mightily to this. It also had to do with the fact that Bush very successfully, his campaign, was harmonizing the free media with the paid media. It was all one. Indeed, it looked for a period of time as if the free media, the nightly news, was part of the paid media in this campaign, for the Bush campaign, which we might want to talk about later. But there indeed was a concordance, a harmony between the two. And I, frankly, was unable to discern at this point in the campaign, or really at any point in the Dukakis campaign until the last 2 weeks, any kind of media strategy, not the least of which any kind of harmony between free and paid media. There was a flipping around of themes from the theme of the week, moving around, and what was on the nightly news was not what was on the commercials. There was just a lack of synchronization. There was a lot of new media that we talk about in the book that may be arguably something that is a bit new this time around. This stuff has been on the shelf before and has been used a wee bit, but satellite technology, cable, VCRs, some of the new computer technology was really pulled off the shelf and used in an important way for the first time in this 1988 election. There was a real flurry of activity using this array of new media. Lots of different uses. The uses of satellite, where the candidates sent their own programming, their own interviews, directly bypassed the networks in Washington and sent their message directly to local television stations hungry for programming in essentially what we call in the book unmediated media, or what we might call video press releases. If this stuff had appeared in print journalism, it would have had a rim around the perimeter around the page saying this was paid for by South Korea, or it's paid political advertising. Satellite technology really took off, both in the primaries and in the general election. And also this Chinese water drop torture that I was alluding to before, a lot of that was handled on cable television here by the Bush campaign. They had the famous Willie Horton ad, or it's an interesting question. It was really independent political action committees that did this. The Willie Horton political ad was on cable television for 12 weeks before there was any response. And the point of that is we've got heavy penetration of cable in the South and the West, and the first stage strategy of the Bush campaign was to try to lock up, to appeal on the conservative instincts of the South and the West and lock up those 200 or so electoral college votes there, and they did that very successfully. They also ran this stuff on CNN on cable, which the Dukakis campaign rejected, knowing that maybe it's not all that cost effective in terms of affecting the whole mass public, but who watches CNN every day, all the time? News people. It's on in newsrooms around this country, and part of the strategy of the Bush campaign, that is a very sophisticated, subtle understanding of the way paid advertising works, is not simply to try to affect the hearts and minds of the voters, but to affect the hearts and minds, or at least something, the thinking of journalists, that the agenda of what they would be talking about, the questions they would be asking, the way they would be thinking would be affected by political ads, and the Bush campaign did that effectively. Well, I want to quiet down here for a minute. would, since I'm a professor, I want to end on a more academic note and not so current eventsy, maybe. And as we know, history is a good way of doing that. You know what they say, rubbish is rubbish, but the history of rubbish, that's scholarship. And so let me conclude with an historical reference, and this will be a question to the class. The question is, in America's first presidential elections, the voters were offered a choice, first of all, between George Washington or John Adams, then John Adams or Tom Jefferson, then Tom Jefferson or Aaron Burr. In recent elections, we've had the choice between George McGovern or Richard Nixon, Gerald Ford or Jimmy Carter, Ronald Reagan or Mondale, now George Bush or Michael Dukakis. The question is, what does this prove? I would submit to you that this proves that Darwin was wrong. And, of course, the joke is on us. And I would also submit to you that that's one of the underlying themes of the 1988 presidential election, the Darwin was wrong problem. The Darwin was wrong problem we have felt not only in the general election but in the primaries. The feeling by the electorate that they're not happy with the alternatives and about the way the alternatives, the candidates, are waging the campaign. The voters are fed up. The voters are unenthusiastic. The voters have sort of had it. They're not very happy. And this was in the primaries and not just the general election. Remember, we talked about the seven dwarfs back in those days, and there was that kind of feeling. But this is not something new. This is citizens have been happy for a long time with the kind of choices they've been given. Turnout has been low and declining. It's useful to remember a group like this that will come out on a Monday night to talk about politics, that we are tremendously unrepresentative of the American public. In 1976, when we did polling in that campaign and asked people whether they had watched any of the TV debates between Jimmy Carter and Gerald Ford, a woman in Pittsburgh, and this is a true story, said to us, "Oh yes, I watched some of the first one, and then I turned it off. I didn't want either of them influencing my vote. I wanted to make up my own mind." That's where most of the American public is these days, and I think the trends that I'm talking about, the candidate-centered and TV-dominated campaigns, have only accentuated, added to, and aggravated that kind of problem.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Oren. Dr. Oren is appearing here as the representative of the Harvard Yard Boutique. And he said a lot of controversial things that we'll get back to later and give you a shot at as well. But I think the most controversial thing he said was, I think I heard him assert that journalists do have a heart. Christopher Adderton is the Dean of the Graduate School of Public Management in New York. Prior to that, becoming the Dean, he was on the Yale faculty for 10 years as a professor of political science. His PhD is from MIT, where he was a student of the legendary political scientist Ithiel de Sola Pool. He's the author of 4 books on party politics, presidential politics, campaign finance, and media influence on politics. He is as well as a specialist on public opinion, and he has been doing polling for Newsweek. Chris?
Thank you very much. Well, Gary took us back 200 years, and I only wanted to take you back 40 years to the campaign of 1948 to set the tone for my remarks. There we had a hard-driving charge by a Democratic candidate in the face of polls that showed him with an overwhelming loss coming up to the Republican candidate. One of the two candidates was the vice president, or had been the vice president of a popular president, who'd done much to change the political discourse, the ideological landscape of the nation. But actually, my reason for reflecting on that election has less to do with the similarities or the differences between those candidates and the differences between Dukakis and Truman, and not to make a prediction about the campaign that we're going to see concluded tomorrow, but more to talk about the process of campaigning and the conduct of election, and to set the stage by thinking in particular about the role of television in our politics. In 1948, there was a minuscule audience. There were very limited hours of broadcasting in a few cities. There were no political ads. and so forth. 40 years ago, one might have looked forward to the promise of television. And those who were not betting against its potential, and we go through some amusing anecdotes in the book where we talk about how people thought that television was going to amount to nothing, others could be wildly optimistic about the promises that television were going to bring to politics. After all, large numbers of voters didn't even recognize the candidates for whom they were going to vote, or at least on the congressional district level and smaller. In a study done in Elmira County in that year, 1948, when voters were asked to identify 9 prominent figures, over 2/3 could identify 3 candidates or less out of that 9. Few voters had very specific knowledge of the stands of the major issues by the 2 candidates. Again, in that Elmira study, 85% could not correctly associate the 2 candidates for president with the 2 major issues that were facing the electorate in that year. They got it loused up. Too many voters went to the polls with only vague notions about what were the differences between the 2 parties. The party of the common man or the little guy versus the party of peace and prosperity, summarized for people a lot of what they knew about politics, about the choice facing them of parties, but not much else, I think, penetrated. And in this context, one might have, if we were sitting here 40 years ago thinking about the context of television, said, what a wonderful thing this is going to be for our electorate. Like radio, it's going to reach into everyone's home directly with first-hand information about politics. Voters will actually see events happening. They'll be able to participate in presidential events. They'll be able to see the debates. The mere prospect of debates must have been seemed unlimited at that point. Particularly an opportunity to contrast the candidates' views and to really get to know what they're like as persons and so forth. In short, one could have looked at the promise of television as one of creating an informed electorate for us. Well, obviously it didn't work out that way. Here we are 40 years later. Politics has become, as the topic of this talk is, a video game, and not much has shown of a beneficial nature in that 40 years. 1988 is the culmination, the latest culmination, perhaps not the last culmination, of the trends that have been going on since at least 1968. 20 years ago we had the selling of the president, and today we've had basically that same strategy in both purchased media and the free media, or the earned media, with the cumulative skill of 4 elections, leading to the techniques of news management, which we've just seen a prime example of on the Bush side and to a lesser extent on the Dukakis side over the past 3 months. The change between a press secretary and the director of communications for a campaign has been a pronounced change, leading to news management, control over the daily agenda of issues, minimization of the contact between reporters and a politician, a candidate, as a way of making sure that that daily theme that's very carefully managed is the only thing that's reportable that happens that day. Very careful control over everything that a candidate says, an explicit effort to link the free media, the events that a campaign is staging, with the paid media, so that the credibility of the paid media will be enhanced. These are the techniques. 1988 marks the coming of age, therefore, of soundbite politics, in which political rhetoric has been neatly packaged into short segments that make television newscasts, in which candidates have learned one-liners that will slam dunk their opponents and discover that those one-liners will be more reportable than, say, even a short soundbite of one's own positive advocacy of positions. In some ways, they play upon the definition of news as conflictual, and to the extent that they can give a snappy one-liner on a daily basis that attacks their opponent and puts their opponent on the disadvantage, they know they're going to make the news, and that's what's going to be quoted that day. 1988 is the year in which candidates at all levels have learned to take one small fact and to blow it up into a major and often distorted conclusion about their opponents. I come from Connecticut. We're seeing a major, aggressive, negative campaign by the candidate on the Democratic side against a longtime popular senator on the Republican side, and it's been devastatingly effective, I'm afraid. 1988 is also a year in which control over the headlines through news management means political mastery, framing that question, regardless of the logic, regardless of the importance of the issue that's raised, regardless of the fairness of the attack. These things are being learned by politicians on all levels, and they're mounting with increasing fury. In my own school, I'm going to go back a week from tonight. I start a course which we call euphemistically the news media and politics. It's actually a course in how does one orchestrate news attention, how does one do this thing. So now there's a graduate school training people to do this, and I'm the dean of it. So I see the 1988 election as an indictment of all sides of the triangle that makes up our process of political communication. It's an indictment of the voters, those that turn in late to a campaign, that are not very interested in a race, that are not very knowledgeable about the issues, that are marginal even in their commitments to vote. These facts constitute the reality that soundbite politics is intended to accommodate, intended to coexist in. The conclusion to be drawn from comparing the audiences of the McNeil-Lehrer report with Peter Jennings is rather unfortunate for our politics, but it's a reality with which politicians must live. For the candidates, there's an indictment too, and their handlers, or the manipulators of politics. Their failure to exercise leadership in this, to demand more of the electorate, I think, their use of instrumental manipulation of the public opinion forming process, I think, has gone quite far, too far. A lot of this pertains to what our book is about, the influence of technology, especially in finding out the ability of voters of candidates to find out what voters want, what they fear, what will move them one way or another, and then the technology of getting messages out to voters. Technology has, I think, done a great deal of change for the nature of the conduct of presidential campaigns. That is, I'm not arguing at this point that it has an impact on voters and voters' opinions, but more that it has an impact on the way in which politicians politic. There's also, I think, an indictment here of the media for allowing politicians to get away with it, and for I see the relationship between politicians and journalists as both competitive, inherently competitive, but also in some ways as cooperative and mutually supporting. It's a political relationship, in my view, in which both sides have been trying to define the bounds of fair reporting, and I think that the candidates have been winning that race, and I think you see in press commentary now a great deal of frustration with being manipulated. They know they're being manipulated, they're being used to get their message out, and they're desperately frustrated about it, and so they are heaping caustic commentary upon the candidates and upon the campaign managers and the handlers of the media, and that doesn't do, it seems to me, our political system much good. It's not surprising to me that large numbers of the American public after this campaign is turned off, both because of what the candidates have been saying about each other and what the news media has been telling us about both sides of the campaign. And I might add that I think there's an indictment here for academic commentators who sit around and pontificate about how bad things are when we don't really have such very good ideas about how they might be changed. I guess I don't have to dwell on this. You're all, by the fact that you're here, you're all political junkies, and by the fact that you're political junkies, you're consumers of news products, so you know what has been going on in considerable detail. But I don't think that we yet know the whole story about how bad this campaign has been, and it will take us a while to learn that. In retrospect, I think it's going to be worse, and it's going to, it may even be worse in the 1992 elections. I have here a 22-minute documentary entitled Justice on Furlough that is circulating in this country sub rosa, not as part of the campaign, produced by the Eagle Forum of Phyllis Schlafly's fame. It is a 22-minute expose of Willie Horton, and you can see for 1995 in this all of the graphic details, the lurid details of Willie Horton's brutalizing of that couple in Maryland. And you can see an equally strong presentation of the efforts of the Massachusetts correctional system to stonewall it when people tried to ask how was it that this person got out. Even the governor was in fact complicit in the effort not to let out details and to keep at least the furlough program going under some considerable pressure from a group in Massachusetts called Cause. Now, quite apart from the merits of that particular case, I just want to point out that this is a very professionally produced videotape. It's subtle in its presentation of fact. It looks like something out of 60 Minutes. It's a documentary format. There's a voiceover narrating this all the way through. Interviews conducted. They go to the scene of the original robbery here in Massachusetts, and they talk to the mother and father of the young boy who was killed. So it appears to be a very objective piece of reporting. And I would have to take this, I think, to a number of people at the State House and the State Capitol to get their view of exactly how objective this is. This tape does not advocate the defeat of Michael Dukakis nor the election of George Bush. It doesn't have to. It's, quote, just a factual report about an issue that you might happen to be interested in. It's outside, in short, the bounds of the Federal Election Campaign Act. Doesn't have to be reported. None of the expenditures for it are traced or put through the Federal Election Campaign Act because it is just merely an educational piece by the Eagle Forum. Yet, I think about 5,000 copies of this have been sold by the Eagle Forum, and the others are circulating sub rosa wherever there is a person who is strongly anti-Dukakis who happens to have two videotapes, two VCRs. Copies of these are being proliferated and passed around. I got it from my neighbor who was given it to him by a friend who passed it on to another neighbor, and so forth. What else is going on out there? I don't think we'll know for a while, and I think it will take a while for us to document that. Now, I have some recommendations for you to contemplate. First is that between 1955 and 1975, there was an organization in this country called the Fair Campaign Practices Commission, which was noticeably ineffective because it didn't have much money and was also a rather do-gooder type organization. It asked candidates to subscribe to a code of fair practices, and it published the names of those that wouldn't. It had a complaint process that people could bring to it complaints when they felt that they had been grievously harmed in the electoral process. And this Fair Campaign Practices Commission would try to reach a verdict beforehand and to publicize that verdict through the news process. They didn't have much money, and frankly, it's a very difficult question. But I think we'd be well served by some kind of vehicle like that where we could revitalize that, maybe with the parties participating, if that's not too naive, by each sending a representative and maybe somebody from the networks. It can make a difference. For example, the 4As, the American Association of Advertising Agencies, had in the 1986 elections a little project in which they asked people who were their affiliates to let them know when they thought they saw particularly distorted advertising. And in one instance, in Cincinnati, Ohio, there was a candidate running for state senate, and the local chapter of the 4As got together, and they went to the local newspaper and they said, after looking at this ad, they said, this is really beyond the pale. These ads are a clear travesty upon our profession, which is producing ads. And the newspaper printed this story, and the candidate threatened to sue the 4As, but pulled his ads and didn't sue the 4As. Actually, I don't even know whether that candidate won or lost the election. But he pulled his ads, and I think that's important. So I'm not sure, really, that a Fair Campaign Practices Committee would be able to take a strong view or a moderate view of the recent campaign, but I think its existence there would help to diminish a lot of the distortion that I see as taking place. Second, Ed has just finished 6 months of being working for the Commission on Presidential Polls, being the executive director of the debates, presidential debates. I think that ought to become somehow tied into the Federal Election Campaign Act. It seems to me that it is not too much to ask candidates who take the public money in the fall that they should sign on for participation in the debates as mandatory for that. That doesn't mean we're going to get 4 debates or 3 debates, in my view, but it lessens the leverage that candidates have over the conduct of the debates. And it seems to me if they're forced to do it, the Presidential Commission would be there and able to specify much more in terms of the number of debates and the format in which questions were going to be asked and not asked. In my own senatorial race, which I spoke about a moment ago between Lieberman and Weicker, they had the candidates go back and forth amongst themselves several times, and that was quite beneficial. They began asking each other, so they began the mud balls were throwing them directly rather than vicariously through the journalist. Finally, I would say I'm a strong believer in the First Amendment, and I've been thinking for 15 years and arguing in such forums that some kind of ban on 30-second ads or some kind of provision of free time was a bad idea. And I'm aware of all of those the reasons why it's a bad idea. But I'm now, in the context of the '88 campaign, beginning to think about how that might become structured in a way that would be beneficial and in keeping with the First Amendment. I don't have an answer for that. Maybe some of you do. But I think there's a question there that we ought to be re-examining more closely. How could we better make use of television, and what kind of regulatory provisions would be permissible under the Constitution? Thank you.
Provocative ideas, and on some of your ideas on reforms, Roger Ailes, of all people, has called for a conference after this campaign is over where people can get together and talk about reforms. On your second idea, I think it's a good idea to link the money to the commission as long as we don't get paid civil service wages. And finally, I wonder if one might add a third idea, and that perhaps it would be much easier, not a First Amendment issue, if television stations who are by law now required to charge the lowest prevailing rate to politicians for political ads were allowed to let the free market set the prices, and maybe if the prices went up, they wouldn't use it so much, and we wouldn't have a constitutional crisis either. We're next going to hear from Jeffrey Abramson. Dr. Abramson is a professor of politics at Brandeis. He teaches political philosophy and constitutional law. He is the author of Liberation and Its Limits, the Moral and Political Thought of Freud. He is the co-editor of the Electronic Commonwealth. He's a member of the Massachusetts Bar and a graduate of Harvard Law School, and his PhD is also from Harvard. He did his undergraduate work at Amherst College, and he is a political theorist. Dr. Abramson.
Well, the hour is already getting late, and we really do want to hear from you, so let me put aside my notes and limit myself to 2 points. First, I want to argue that television is getting a bum rap, and that whatever else was wrong with this campaign, it isn't to be traced to television. And second, I want to argue that if there is a criticism of the media to make, it certainly isn't limited to the electronic press, but would be something that would go to the work of journalists and the journalistic ethic in covering campaigns entirely. Let me start on the television side then and try to make a defense. We don't know yet who's going to win the campaign, fortunately. But if George Bush does win, the postmortems certainly will include grave indictments of television and will include weak to strong charges that Bush stole this election by controlling television, by using television to set the agenda to Dukakis's advantage. And in the latter weeks of the campaign, we've already seen Dukakis himself take up this theme of essentially scapegoating television. But I think it is an attempt to paper over the cracks in the Dukakis campaign by putting the blame on television. And I would argue the case simply something like this. As a medium, as a technology, television stood ready and willing and open to Dukakis and to Bush to provide a platform for reaching voters. In the case of Dukakis, it was clear that television gave him a platform from which he could articulate a compelling vision to the American people about the Democratic Party's response to the Reagan social revolution. It was clear coming into this election, or at least it should have been clear to the Democratic Party, that while they could not respond to the free market side of conservatism and the Reagan Revolution, they needed a response to the arguments about community, about local control, about alienation, about loss of citizen power, the cluster of issues about school prayer, about religion, about morality and values, and so forth. It was incumbent upon Dukakis to have a broad affirmative vision of the Democratic Party's response to those things. But it was Dukakis and not television who announced that the theme of this election was competence, not ideology. That is to say, it was the Democratic standard bearer who attempted to mute or silence substantive debate on the issues and to make this a referendum about leadership. Insofar as he got what he asked for, a referendum on leadership sans issues, leadership apart from ideology, leadership apart from a true Democratic Party platform, he got that, and the voters found him wanting as the kind of leader, symbolic leader they wanted in the President of the United States. But the important point, it seems to me, is underlying that one, and that is that Bush was able to use television to not let Dukakis get away with it. That is to say, Bush pinned him quite adroitly to the wall on certain ideological issues, the ones you're familiar with. The cluster of issues on the Reagan social revolution side: crime, furloughs, flag salutes, patriotism, continuation of the referendum on the 1960s, attitude toward country in the Vietnam War. On all of these issues, I don't think it was quite dirty campaigning for Bush to say, I'm going to demand a referendum on those kinds of ideological issues. And Bush did adroitly, I think this much can be said, that Bush, more successfully than Dukakis, used television to control the agenda and to set those issues out on the table. But it isn't television's fault that there was not forthcoming a response, a Democratic Party response to that, or at least it came quite late. It was a choice that seems it's unclear what the basis of that choice was, but it seems to have been a deliberate choice on the part of the Democratic Party standard bearer here to not attempt to give a spirited defense of what Democratic Party values would be in these areas. And on certain of them, for instance, abortion, the polls say that he could have done quite well by, in fact, taking it to Bush on that issue. But on none of these did he, in fact, announce an affirmative vision of what he stood for. And it seems to me that the lesson one learns from the power of negative advertising here is that why did issues like furloughs and flags stick to Dukakis as they did? A candidate who had succeeded in mapping out for the American public a robust profile of himself and his party would have had something to fall back on. But here there was very little for Dukakis to fall back on other than the issues that Bush raised and Dukakis was unwilling to really defend on. There simply was a vacuum. Now, that vacuum flowed from the slogan, "Competence, not ideology," from an attempt to define leadership in narrow managerial terms. And when the election became one about the symbolism of the presidency, which the American people have a right to demand, and did demand, they it seems to me, essentially found Dukakis wanting because there was a silence there. But it's hard to see how any of the classic criticisms of television, that it selects for money, that it selects for good looks, that it selects for visuals, that it selects for personality, condemn Dukakis per se. It's hard to trace any of the difficulties of his campaign to television. It seems to me far better to trace them to, in fact, his sense, if you want to put it this way, that the only Democratic candidate that could win this time was one who ran as a Republican. And that Bush did not allow him to do. Now, how negative that is, I leave for you to judge. Trying to keep my remarks short, let me just leave it at that and turn to the second one. What does the organized press do when a candidate is as successful as Bush was in controlling the agenda? It seems to me there is a choice for the journalistic ethic there. One choice, which is a commendable and praiseworthy one, is essentially a laissez-faire, non-interventionist response, which is we should mirror the candidates. We should be an open forum for reporting the issues that they raise. And if, in fact, a candidate raises furloughs and flags and crime, who is it for the press to say furloughs aren't a presidential issue? They seem to capture the public's imagination, so we will simply report on those. It seems to me that this mirror ethic, or the job of the press to be the mirror, was the one that we saw here, and therefore, given Dukakis's failure, the press was not there to set an independent agenda. Now, there is an alternative understanding of the press, which has, in our history, been quite powerful, and that is that the press has an adversarial job vis-a-vis government and an adversarial job vis-a-vis the candidates, that it ought to have an independent sense of what the campaign is about, and if the candidates aren't going to raise those issues, the press should raise them. For instance, one would have thought that one of the issues in this election was sober talk about how best to support continued perestroika in the Soviet Union, how to take advantage of this historic opportunity, and who was better situated to in fact allow the continued liberalization of the Soviet Union to continue. But the candidates didn't raise that, and the press didn't either. Or the future of El Salvador after Duarte. Neither candidate wanted to raise that. The press dropped it. It seems to me that what we did witness here was one candidate's more successful, adroit use of television, and the organized press decision, I wouldn't call it a failure, but choice across the board to not opt for the adversarial ethic, but to be reporters in the narrow but accurate sense. And once that decision was made, it piggybacked with Dukakis's strategy, which was not to try to have an affirmative democratic agenda on many of these issues, and Bush was left controlling the agenda, it seems to me, across the board on issues that he was stronger with the public than Dukakis was, and if he wins tomorrow, that seems to me to be the name of the game.
We've all talked about the role of the press. That was a particularly interesting one when you drew the distinction between the behavior of the press, whether it should be adversarial, and having been in newsrooms where those debates were carried on, I think it's fair to say that the mainstream press, the ones with the biggest number of readers and number of viewers, it does not take an adversarial role in campaigns because they don't want to have that role. They're afraid of exercising, quote, power, unquote. But I wonder if it also might, in your view, raise the other question, and that is, the parties have pretty much abdicated their role in terms of disciplining campaigns and bringing candidates to the surface, and that role has largely been transferred to the press and particularly to television. You don't really have to have the approval of the party bosses. All you have to be able to do is catch the attention of the television news people and therefore ride that coattail into an Iowa primary victory or whatever. But does your theory admit to the possibility, Dr. Abramson, that perhaps the press is extremely limited in its other powers, that it is not able to either set or enforce an agenda?
Yeah, I think one of the things that I do want to stress is I think television's power, for instance, is exaggerated. But if we had an ethic in journalism which made it incumbent upon the press to try to shine the light on issues of substantive importance in their controversial judgment that the candidates were ignoring because it didn't fit with their strategies, then I think we would see. I mean, it's not a question of inherent power in the press. I don't think they have inherent power to manipulate or to control the agenda simply by having loud voices or resources. The question ultimately would be whether it resonated with the American public. And all I'm trying to speak to is not being condemned from the start, a priori condemned to have to follow the candidate's sense of what public important issues are, because the candidates, after all, have electoral strategies to pursue. The press doesn't. And if they would open up this debate, as controversial as those judgments would be, it seems to me that the public would then be in a better position to demand of the candidates a wider discussion of the issues, that commentators in the print press especially would pick up on this, and it would either resonate or not.
Professor Martin, you made a point earlier that perhaps one of the few new technologies this time around is the video cassette that you showed us. Read recently that this woman running for Congress in a Northern California district, and her strategy was to distribute 110,000 video cassettes to potential voters. The VCR is the fastest-selling electrical appliance in the history of American consumerism. The Ayatollah Khomeini, as I understand it, campaigned for his return to Iran largely by distributing audio cassettes because the tape recorder was so pervasive through Iran. Is the video cassette the wave of the future? Is it a passing fancy? Is it this year's Edsel? What do you see its role being? Is it going to revolutionize our politics?
Well, I think when we confronted this issue in writing the book, we were perplexed by predictions of specific nature about which technologies were going to be the wave of the future and which were going to come to characterize the long-run future, much less the short-run future. One could go back to the late 1960s, which we did, and find lots of stories about the growth of cable television and how wonderful it was going to be. And then you get to the mid-1970s and people are saying, where's cable? Where did it go to? And then you get HBO, and cable comes back onto the agenda again as being the hot new item, and it starts to take off at that point. So we thought that there were some statements that one could make about the things that are going on, the trends in communications that would exist and happen regardless of what the specific manifestation of them were. For example, we think that there are going to be more conduits rather than less conduits available, that the speed of communications is going to increase, and so it doesn't matter to us whether that's going to be over computers or cable or satellites or VCR or whatnot. So I think we don't really want to make specific statements about that, except I would say that that something took place on the night of the debates, is probably taking place tonight when the candidates are giving their final appeal, which is that people who have VCRs now have much more control over their own viewing habits than they had 10 years ago. And people can, even though the candidates are going to roadblock across the three networks, people have choices that they can watch other things, or anybody who's got a video cassette recorder can watch Out of Africa or their latest movie or whatever they want to watch, and to avoid the political discourse of tonight. And I think that's a trend that's likely to happen. I think that we will finally, for some people, that Phyllis Schlafly is not the first nor the last who will produce a lot of small short video cassettes of a political nature that will go out and perhaps have an impact on people's thinking. If you're willing to sit down and watch 22 minutes of Willie Horton, I'll hand this to anybody who wants to actually watch 22 minutes of Willie Horton, but it could have an impact on some people's thinking.
I interviewed the man who is Dukakis's advertising manager tonight, and I asked him what he thought he would get in terms of an audience share, and he said they'd be lucky to get 40% tonight. That's because not only of the proliferation of cable, which is now in more than half of the American households, but it's also because, and particularly because of the rise of the independent stations as well as the VCR. Even there is no such thing as a roadblock anymore. The three networks are down to about 69% now, even in their entertainment programming, the lowest they've ever been. They used to routinely be about 90. Even the first debate, which was carried by the three commercial networks as well as PBS and CNN, was delayed and later broadcast by Fox. The audience share was 63. Gary, someone said in this room about a year ago that the television camera is like an X-ray machine over the course of a long campaign. This campaign has lasted, by Governor Dukakis's estimation, 600 days, 605 days to be exact. I don't know how long Vice President Bush would say his campaign has gone on, perhaps 8 years. Is it true, in your view, that the television camera is an X-ray machine that reveals all about a candidate over the course of a long campaign?
Before I answer that, I want to quickly respond, just say a quick word to my colleague, because I detect a different point of view than expressed in our joint book. I want to make sure of things here. I think I agree in part with what you said on number one, mostly with what you said on number one, but not at all with number two of your point. On the point of number one about television, we go to great pains in the book to claim that we're not technological determinists. Like matches, technology can be. It's the people who use them for good or bad, who misuse them, abuse them, use them properly, and so forth. And these technologies are the same. So that's absolutely right. And the real dilemma is Dukakis's lack of use. He muffed it, and why he didn't respond and use the medium as could be used. But beyond, so that's of course, but beyond that, there are certain, let me put it this way, move away from even intrinsic tendencies in the technology that are better suited to certain technologies, to an easier argument, it seems to me, that we should be able to claim that the current menu of the way television is used is not a very nourishing kind of meal for our democracy, that 30 and 60-second spots or 10-second sound bites on the nightly news is not a way to really illuminate and have an election, and that indeed the way the television is used in those kinds of formats invite distortions, at least misleading statements, if not outright distortions, and I think we've seen examples of it. And I think the question is, to go back to some of Chris' suggestions, can we think of other more nourishing kinds of formats, longer formats. I think, in fact, they will pass constitutional muster because of the licensing power. Evening time, or the Packwood bill about that if anybody makes an ad, a political ad, that candidate has to be in that ad himself, or it can't be just 30 or 60 seconds. It needs to be a little longer. In fact, maybe. But I think that's one of the problems with television. On the second point about the media, whether they are adversarial or step back and just be a messenger, first of all, one has to say there's a difference between news reporting and columnists, commentators. And what struck me, especially in the early stages of the campaign, was the silence of the media, including of print people and television people, when it came to the absence of the accessibility of George Bush. Eventually it became Michael Dukakis, sort of grudgingly, but Bush had not made himself available to the press, did not hold regular routine press conferences in the primary time or in the general election, especially in the early days, and this was key, and this was critical in those first 10 weeks. And one looked in vain for any comment by the press, and presumably the press should rise to defense of that kind of press ethic, the need for accountability, the need for access to a candidate, so that the diet would not only be 30 and 60-second spots, mostly 30-second spots, the Willie Horton kinds of spots. But yet there was silence. I think the press was, now later in the campaign, some members of the press became extremely self-righteous, beating their breasts and saying, whoa, we're not going to tolerate this anymore, this is terrible. But at the time when it really mattered, there was silence. I think the press were willing co-conspirators in this sort of restraint of information to the American public, and that is an important freedom. And it's important that the press rise to defend and demand access of public officials to them. Now, on the X-ray, I think quickly the answer is yes and no.
Quickly.
There you go. That's enough. I felt that the public at this point has a fairly accurate reading and perception of Michael Dukakis, of the man. It's not perfect. He's much smarter, more disciplined, a harder worker than they probably know. But that most of the downsides that the public feels and expresses to us in polls and elsewhere are basically right, and the lens of the camera really brought that out to them, conveyed that. I think the public that the television did not serve as a penetrating X-ray, sort of scrutinizing prism on George Bush. I think that the public does not know much about George Bush. I am frankly, personally, very confused about George Bush.
Did you see the PBS documentary that Sherry Jones and Gary Wills did called The Choice?
Yes, I thought that was superb.
I thought that was pretty penetrating of George Bush.
Now that was excellent.
And Michael Dukakis.
I think that was excellent. I'd like to know what the rating was on that show, how many people saw that. I think it was excellent.
Well, maybe the people didn't watch it, but the press did.
Yeah, that's right. The press did, though it was in the last month of the campaign. It was after the famous 17-point poll and the big ABC poll and so forth, and people thought the election was over, regrettably. But I think that, by and large, he was able to hide behind the 30 and 60-second spot and the 10-second well-spun, well-controlled soundbite on the nightly news, he being George Bush, and that I think people do not have a very good view of him. And I think, in fact, it will is to his disservice at this point if he were to win the election tomorrow when it comes to the question of governing. I think that the media, who are very angry, as Chris said, feel a little guilty. We're going to see some compensatory Bush bashing, I think, right off the mark. I think it's very difficult for someone to govern in this country, and that it will be even more difficult in this time.
I think, just to say a word about television, I think it's It's a narrow definition of television news, though, to say that it was only sound bites. I think you have to look at, as they do at the networks, the full output of what they do, and they cover in news reports as well as in special broadcasts the primaries, the conventions, the acceptance speeches in their entirety, the debates. This year, I think because of the repeal of the Fairness Doctrine a few months ago, there was a willingness to put on a candidate for an extended interview, as ABC did with Nightline, even when his opponent is not willing to come, because with fairness now gone, you don't have to worry about that. So I just think you're defining TV news narrowly.
I think that gave people, it's one of the things that contributed to a pretty accurate view of Mike Dukakis. It's just that by and large Bush hasn't been there.
He was in hand-to-hand combat with Dan Rather in January. That was a pretty revealing interview, I think. Anyway, let's go to Dr. Abramson. Did you want to respond, or?
Well, I have some responses, but I don't mind waiting.
Okay. Well, see if you had a question. We have about 10 minutes for questions.
Well, I have sort of a jumble of perceptions, so it may not be as coherent as I'd like it to be. Just share a couple observations and see what kind of reaction there is. First of all, I agree with you. I did hear a difference, what seemed to be a difference about the role of television. I was glad you spoke to that. It seems to me that television does seem to have a very powerful impact, at least from my perspective. It seems to me that one important way to understand what I call the national corporate news, is that it's a vehicle for carrying a commercial load, and I think that's what that understanding can lead to some insights about this process.
But all of journalism is advertiser based, or else it would cost you much more to buy it.
That doesn't take anything away from my observation.
Okay.
And we do have public television.
Just an observation on my part.
And we do have NPR. The fact of the matter is, not everybody listens to NPR. Not everybody watches PBS. There is a way in which the way commercial television covers and handles the campaign, and also handles the debates, shapes the way people are responding to this process. That's what I'd like to hear people speak to. For example, one of the ideas I'm thinking about is in covering a debate. Before the debate begins, the debate is not allowed to stand on its own for itself. Before the debates came on, there were people there who were quite willing to tell the viewers the basis on which we should decide who won or didn't win those debates. You won the debate if you didn't look bad, or you won the debate if da-da-da-da-da. The debates were not allowed to stand on their own. That's one example of how the kinds of intervention that there are.
Let's ask Professor Arden to respond. Is there something wrong with the way that okay.
Okay, well, let me say, I think that the evidence about precisely what impact messages that come through television have on the voting public is very mixed. For example, it's quite clear to everybody that Jimmy Carter won the debate in which Gerald Ford made the Polish gaffe, the gaffe about Poland. There were, if you looked at the question when the debate was first over, the polls when the debate was first over, it was very close. The further away you got, it began to grow like this, where by 6 p.m. the next night, 80% of the public were saying Jimmy Carter won the debate, 10% were saying Gerald Ford won the debate, from being very close like this. It became a factual question. It didn't have any impact on the choice that people were making in the polls. It had a devastating impact on the candidates and the way in which they conducted their campaigns for the next few days. It totally threw the Ford campaign off. Similarly, the second debate, I would argue, had very little impact on, sustained impact on the public's opinion of the two candidates.
Which second debate? In 76 or 88? Okay.
The second debate this year had an ephemeral impact. You can see the tracking polls, and George Bush jumps up that 17% point. It comes right after that debate. But then by a week later or so, it's dropped off, so that the question of who wins a debate and loses a debate is in some ways, for large numbers of the public, irrelevant to their choice, I think. So the question about impact of what goes over the television on people's views is quite a murky thing, and we need a lot more research on that point.
Professor Abramson.
Yes, you raise what to me at least is a central question about advertising pressures in the media, and when we come to television, ratings pressures in particular. And I think it's fair to say that in the process of writing our book, this was a subject of deep debate and discussion among the three of us. So I won't try to speak for the three of us, I'll just speak for myself. I think that while all media in the United States, or almost all media in the United States, are advertiser-driven in some sense of that term, television is incredibly advertiser-driven. That its sense of program selection outside of the political realm is deeply in debt to what advertisers are willing to pay for, and that its sense of audience is so mass-based that television does fit ill with the basic underlying pluralism and diversity of tastes in American life. That there is a familiar, homogenized product on network television that has, in my mind, much to do with the advertiser financing of television. And I would agree with you that that is a problem for a democracy, just how to get variety into the popular entertainment program of television, whose walks of life are going to be reflected, whose kinds of entertainment. But it does seem to me that when it... Yes, that there are limits during the year, outside of campaigns, there are strict limits to how much a network is willing to cede from advertiser-driven programmings to network news. But the but that I do want to emphasize, however, is it seems to me that those rules of economics are flexible, and in the campaign and in the election, we're not so incumbent on this phenomenon of borrowed time, and that the fact of the matter is, in this election, there was an incredible devotion of television resources to covering this campaign, and that for all the sound bites, it was also true that there were sustained hour-long or 90-minute couple-type shows, so that for people who wanted it was there. And I think it again is hard to fault television in this regard for simply not providing the electronic forum. I think the electronic forum was there.
And it costs about $50 million per network to cover it. It costs 1.5 times first-class airfare to travel with a candidate, and each network has 2 crews, 2 producers, and 2 correspondents with each candidate. You're next.
Yes, I'd like to. I believe that an important function of a presidential election, besides picking a winner, is to inject and circulate all kinds of ideas into the race. And I would like to bring up the fact that in this election that there are not just 2 candidates in the general election, Dukakis and Bush. In this state there are 4 candidates on the ballot. Nationwide, I believe there are 19 candidates running on at least who are on the ballot in at least one state. I'd like any of you to say something about the fact that the media ignore third parties, and commentators on the media also ignore third parties and their candidates. And do you think that paying no attention to them is justified?
That's a tall order for us, since we're just about out of time, but perhaps one of you could respond quickly to that just before we
I think that
summarize.
should be you, Ed Fui, since your commission is being sued by Lenora Filani.
Yeah, and I voted the other day in the District of Columbia, and there are 8 slates on my ballot. I don't have a glib answer to that. It's a chicken and egg proposition. I'm afraid that people don't get. They're not entitled to attention for their ideas. They have to go out and compete in the marketplace of ideas in order to build public support. We've seen that. I've seen that at least twice in my career, where George Wallace went out and built support for his ideas in the marketplace of ideas in the election of '68, was it? And John Anderson in the election of 1980. A significant third-party candidates. But I don't think anybody is entitled to it without earning it. I'm afraid we're going to have to pass on to our closing statements. If you all have any final thoughts, we've run out of time. A summary? You'd rather take a couple more questions? Okay, we're up against our deadline, but all right, we'll take a couple more. So, are you next? Who's next? Okay, you're next.
I would like to ask Mr. Fui to comment, please, on the League of Women Voters' decision not to hold the debate, and its charge that it was a hoodwinking and a sham.
Well, of course, you'd have to ask them why they decided not to do it. I was at the other end of that, and I don't think it was. I think the debates were the only solid, unrehearsed, totally. I don't want to say unstructured because they were too structured, but they were somewhat spontaneous and substantive events of the whole campaign. It was clear to those of us who were involved in not only the substance but the mechanics that they were having great difficulty raising the money to do to put on the Los Angeles debate. And there was certainly because they have their own agenda, they have their own social agenda. They are not perceived by the candidates as coming to the negotiating table totally with clean hands, that they have a number of legislative proposals, as I think you know, that they support, and others that they oppose, both nationally and state by state, and that is something that's on the table and gets in the way of the negotiations. Did you want to comment on my answer? Okay. You're next.
I'm not sure what's to be, said about it. I was surprised at the press coverage when the main papers, the Times, the Globe, the LA Times, all kind of buried this story in, like, page 12, page 14, and just surprised that the idea that somebody could call the debate a sham and then that it wouldn't get press coverage was a bit surprising.
Perhaps that's a judgment on the fact that her hyperbole was a bit overblown, which I thought it was. The other interesting thing that did not get any coverage at all that I'm aware of is that they attempted to charge the commission the $40,000 that they had paid to rent the Shrine Auditorium plus a $50,000 management charge. And the commission put out what I thought was a very clever statement that said that the League was clearly holding the Shrine Auditorium hostage, and our policy was not to negotiate with terrorists. You're next.
Tisk, tisk. I first would like to observe that I think we might have more edifyingly had this particular presentation 8 years ago, and I say that because I've often wondered if when we look back in, say, 20 years and one examines perhaps one of the largest pieces of the Reagan legacy, whether one of them will not be what we're talking about tonight. And I'm picking up 2 themes that I heard raised tonight from Mr. Oren, the idea of the candidate-driven campaign, which clearly I think Ronald Reagan raised to a new art form, and the manipulation and role of television, which again I would point to Ronald Reagan as being the ultimate master of that. Picking up on what Mr. Fui was asking, I think Dr. Abramson, I think about a book I read by David Broder talking about exploring the whole role of the media, both print and video, and I think the loss of power in the face of the power available to the presidential campaign, and I think not just the president, but even moving down the line to lower offices, that really there's been a power shift. You began to ask Dr. Abramson where the power lies, who is really responsible in pursuing that adversarial role. And I really wonder if Ronald Reagan isn't a good place to start in thinking about the kinds of issues that we're talking about and the whole power allocation. And that's...
Seems to me he came up through the ranks in the Republican Party. How did the rest of you feel? Do you want to talk to that, Jeffrey?
I think I agree with Gary that the candidate-centered campaigns has been building for a long time. It goes back to at least Kennedy, in a way. And I meant it when I said that I thought 1988 was the culmination, the latest culmination of a lot of trends, and that 1992 would probably be yet another culmination of this. And it seems to me Ronald Reagan is certainly a very skilled user of television, but he's shown, I think we've observed that the team that ran Ronald Reagan can bring us George Bush, and that those techniques have been transferred, and that George Bush is a very different person than he was a year ago.
What I guess is there a legacy of course, one of the things that I think Ronald Reagan has done to the American public is essentially resolve this down to the acceptance that Bush is not immediately available. So I thought Ronald Reagan wrote that took that to the ultimate. I mean, he was simply unavailable to the press ever. And at some point, the press sort of, you had the Sam Donaldson approach, essentially, and that was totally maligned. And I think that there's, I guess, it's hard because one gets up there, one loses all the points once trying to make, but to me, the point to the legacy of what Ronald Reagan has done, I think, to the American public and to the press covering any major political figure. The American public has been led to believe that you simply never hear from a person, or that if you do, you see pretty pictures. And that's the dynamic that I see for very successful use of
I made one of many false predictions in this campaign, false prophecies, when I thought that particular legacy, since we were really duplicating that whole business of lack of accessibility, also the debates over the debates, we'll have none of them, just do them our way. I predicted that legacy would embolden the press, and especially the press who had been suffering under 8 years of heavy criticism of having contributed to the Teflon presidency. And as soon as that started, without the press conferences in the fall in particular, I said they're going to scream and yell. And it had just the opposite effect. It seems to be there's where I think the wimpishness wasn't on the Bush side, it was on the press side. And I think there may be something to, I'm not a conspiratorial thinker, but I think there's something to a great sensitivity about dealing with conservative criticism on the part of the press.
The press was blamed by 40% of the respondents to a poll question that I saw for the low tone of the campaign. Very few respondents were willing to blame either candidate, which I thought was a remarkable shifting of responsibility. Okay, you've been patient.
Yes, my name is Stephen Macmillan. I'm from the University of New Brunswick, Canada. Essentially, in due respect, Mr. Chairperson, I must say I'm very disappointed in the panel this evening. I think they have failed to discuss the most important point this evening, which is this misuse of television. Perhaps George Bush has been better placed to misuse this than Michael Dukakis. Perhaps indeed tomorrow the people, the American populace, will decide what honorable politics is all about. Perhaps, Mr. Orrin, as you said previously, Michael Dukakis has not muffed it.
You have your supporters. Okay. That's an interesting point.
I mean, I guess just as a closing thing, I'd certainly sign on personally to being disgusted by the campaign. I mean, I wouldn't want to be misunderstood on that point at all. I think it was conducted on a very low level, well, I think that primarily on Bush's side it was conducted on a very low level. I just want to switch to talking about democracy with a small d for a second. I think the danger is to pontificate in a subtly or not so subtly elitist fashion, as if somehow the people at large are so unsure of themselves, so naive as to be open to vast sorts of manipulation against their interests, so that it just takes a candidate with a smart media advisor to pull the wool over millions of voters' eyes. I must admit to having trouble with that as a starting proposition. It just strikes me as intuitively implausible that television or the media as a whole or campaigns have that kind of power. I think we do need to educate ourselves. We need to enrich the debate, but I don't hold the campaign itself responsible for the mire that American politics finds itself in. There's need for a renaissance of discourse, for a revival of substantive discussion. But my only point was, I just find it intuitively implausible to repeat that phrase, to hinge much on television as a medium as opposed to other media.
Jeffrey, the only reason why I hinge much on it is that, as I tried to say in my opening remarks, I think there's blame aplenty all around this process. Certainly with the candidates and their advisors who have learned, I think, successfully how to manipulate the media. I think there is blame with the American public for its lack of attention to the media, and I think there's some blame that should be cast on journalism. The reason why I point to journalism is it seems to me, of those three, it's the easiest to leverage. That if we could address the problem of some of these problems first through journalism, that it would do a great deal to affect the way in which candidates conduct their campaign, and that might have some impact on the public.
But earlier you had, according to my notes, you had indicted the voters as the chief. Perhaps I misunderstood you, at least as one of the culprits in this equation.
No, absolutely. And I just repeated that a second ago.
Okay, good.
I disagree with that. There is a disagreement. In answering it, but the consequence is that you have fooled, I think, some of the people some of the time here, and some of the time was long enough.
Basically, what we have now is not just an information society, it's a disinformation society. And what we have in Reagan and in Bush is not just great misleaders, but they're great disleaders, and the whole thing is based upon a great lie, the good of economics. Bush passed that off. One of my speakers I put in. If Bush had done the honorable, loyal thing when Reagan asked him to run with him in 1980, he would have said, well, I just can't be party to that. But he liked the idea of being one heartbeat away from the presidency. That's the kind of life he's had all the way up the line. So,
that's an interesting point, but I think that's an interesting point. I think given the high cost of housing in the District of Columbia and the magnificent mansion that goes with the job, it's easy to understand Bush's point of view. I think we've come to the end of another delightful Kennedy School Forum, and we thank you for your attention and your attendance.